if you're trying to sell bonds of a relatively unknown company, corporate bond, those are not going to have too much liquidity. So even assets of similar type can have differential liquidities. For example, there's an asset type called Eurobond. These are typically bonds that are denominated in US dollar, but it is issued outside of US. Example, bonds issued by the government of Russia, bonds issued by government of France. They are euro. I mean, they could be euro or dollar denominated, but if they're dollar denominated, they are called euro bonds. Even the bonds issued by Japan, they're called euro bonds. The term euro has nothing to do with the location. It is kind of a historical accident. Uh, in 60s and 70s, there was a regulation. I think it was Regulation T, if I'm not mistaken. That actually, it was a regulation by Fed that put a limit on how much banks could pay interest to savings accounts. In 60s, that wasn't much of a problem. I think the amount was 3% or something. But in 70s, because of a lot of different things, among which two oil shocks of 1973 and 78 played a big factor, inflation went as high as 10%, 12%. Obviously, 3% didn't cover it. For households, that wasn't much of an issue because they were, blissfully unaware of what was going on. But if you're a corporation, you don't want to leave your cash earning 3% while your costs are increasing 10%. You're gonna go bankrupt very fast that way. So how do you get around that? They didn't want to buy corporate bonds. That market barely existed in the 70s. It's early 80s. It started with Salomon Brothers by a guy named John Meriwether. There's actually a nice little book around that. It's called Liar's Poker. You should read that book. It's very nice. It tells the stories of early Salomon Brothers during the development of corporate bond market and all the leverage buyouts and all that sorts of stuff. If you guys ever watched Pretty Woman, man, you guys are way too young. What Richard Gere was doing over there, he was a leverage buyout guy. And he was doing it by issuing corporate bonds, junk bonds, and what have you. Anyway, those assets are not as liquid, but a U.S. Treasury bond, no problem. All you have to do is put an order, done. So you can convert them quickly into cash. In fact, for most of the firms, when we look at the financials, I'm going to actually combine their cash and short-term securities as if they're cash for ratio calculations, which we're going to do in chapter 3. After that, typically it's accounts receivable. Who's going to tell me what that is? Do you remember? Yes, but the key is it's short term. It's called trade credit sometimes. You sell it to your clients and they say, I can't pay you now, but I'll pay you within 90 days. Those are called accounts receivable. If it's a longer period of time, you actually charge interest on those things, then they are called notes receivable. Notes receivable are basically longer term accounts receivable because they carry interest. Accounts receivable themselves do not carry interest, at least not explicitly, but there's always an implicit interest. I mean, you have two clients. One of them says, I'll pay you in 90 days. The other pays cash right now. The cash guy is going to get a better price, presumably, right? Because you have to fund that, and you're paying something. Accounts receivable is the next liquid class of assets, class of current assets. I mean, you have every expectation that those guys are going to pay. In fact, if you doubt that they won't pay, there's always a counter account. It's called allowances for doubtful accounts. So you always want to look at net accounts receivable. Then you have inventory. It's typically less liquid than we just shorten that to A/R, accounts receivable. Again, that also depends on the inventory. If your inventory is avocados on Walmart shelf, that's pretty liquid. But if your inventory is cars, now that's different. You probably should not even count it among current assets, even though technically we do. But if you're telling a story, I would have classified it as something kind of middle things. But generically, it's considered uh, current assets. And typically, we have something called other current assets. These are things we cannot necessarily classify into one of those groups. But sometimes, for example, if you paid your workers 6 months ahead of time, you tell them, here's your 6 months worth of wages. But they haven't worked a single day for you yet. Those 6 months worth of wages are actually assets. They're prepaid wages. Why? Because they're going to deliver something to you in the future, but you don't have to pay them. But as you pay them, you're going to reduce that prepaid wages amount. So that would be another example of a current assets. Or you have tax refunds that you have already deserved, but you haven't gotten them yet. You know, those are kind of deferred tax assets for short term. So they would be current assets as well. But typically we don't worry about that stuff. You know, at least not in this class. If you're doing very advanced valuation class, then we actually look at those things in detail. And fixed assets are assets that are not current assets, obviously. Or as you guys, I don't know if you guys, as my boys would say, duh, that are not current assets. They are booked at historical cost less any accumulated depreciation, depletion, and or amortization. Even though they're three different words, they roughly means same things. Depreciation typically is associated with fixed assets. You know, you buy a computer, IRS actually allows you to write off, I think about 75% of it in 2 years, because it's considered a 3 years maker's asset. We're going to talk about those later on. It's just that makers is short for modified accelerated cost recovery system compared to straight line depreciation. So if it has a life of 3 years in straight line depreciation, you would write off 1/3 of the value every year. With makers, the first year you would write 1/3, the second year 40 plus or 45 plus. We have tables for those, so you don't have to memorize them. Depletion is another kind of depreciation for assets that are like natural resources. You know, you have an oil well with a proven reserve of, let's say, 1 million barrel. You know, you extracted about half of it. So you depleted half of the resource, so you can write off half of the original cost of acquisition as depletion cost. Amortization, we don't have that much anymore, but in the old days, we had a fixed asset called goodwill. Does anybody know what a goodwill is as an asset? You're going with the word itself, but it has nothing to do with that. Let me give you an example. Google bought YouTube in 2005 for $1.6 billion. They paid cash. Didn't matter. They could have paid stock. I think they paid cash. Uh, but if you looked at YouTube's books at that point, their net book value was $500 million. Their net equity, assets minus liabilities. So when you buy a company, you basically combine your assets and liabilities, right? So you added something that is on books is worth only 5 billion, half a billion, but you actually paid 1.6. Remember, we have double entry bookkeeping, things have to balance out. So you create a contra account, an asset, that's called goodwill. In this case, it would be 1.1. So it is the premium you pay over the book value of an acquisition. That's what a goodwill is. Until 2006, you actually had to amortize that over 40 years. So that means that 1.1 billion, you divide that by 40. So that would make what, 27 and a half million? Every year you're going to write off 27 and a half million as an amortization of goodwill. But starting 2006, FASB or Financial Accounting Standard Board decided that we're not going to do it that way. We're going to leave it as it is, but every year you're going to test that goodwill for impairment. That means, is that asset still worth that much? Okay? Obviously, for YouTube case, that's not the problem. Probably more than half of Google's current value is because of YouTube. So that YouTube acquisition is actually worth close to at least 300 billion these days.